A bobcat kept taking things from her porch, but when she finally decided to follow it, what she discovered was far more terrifying than stolen boots and scraps of fabric. At first, it looked like a wild animal acting strange, but then came the traps hidden in the brush, the blood-stained cloth, and the chilling signs that someone wanted the blame to fall on the wrong creature. Every step deeper into the desert pulled her closer to a secret no one was supposed to uncover. A secret powerful men were desperate to protect. Why would anyone bait a wild predator to look guilty? What dangerous game was she walking into? And when the truth finally comes out, will she make it out alive? Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from. It turns this little corner of the internet into something bigger, something shared. The desert morning brought an unsettling quiet to Ione Beckett's modest porch. She stood there, coffee mug warming her hands, staring at the empty spot where her niece's bright red rain boot had been just yesterday. This wasn't the first thing to vanish. Over the past week, small items had disappeared one by one. A dish towel, an old baseball cap, even the worn cushion from her patio chair. Ione took a careful sip of her coffee, her eyes scanning the dusty ground. As a survey technician, she was trained to notice details others might miss. The tracks were there, clear as day in the sandy soil, distinctive bobcat prints leading away from her porch. She'd grown up in this desert landscape and knew its wildlife well enough to recognize their patterns. But this was different. Setting down her mug, she crouched to examine the prints more closely. They were fresh, probably from early morning. The precise trail showed no wandering. The animal had come straight to her porch, taken what it wanted, and left. This wasn't random scavenging. It was purposeful. Her thoughts were interrupted by movement at the edge of her property. There, in broad daylight, was the bobcat. Its lean frame showed the wear of hard times, its one sleek coat dulled by desert life. But what caught Ione's attention was the familiar flash of red in its mouth. Her niece's missing boot. "Well, I'll be," she whispered, staying perfectly still as she watched the creature. The bobcat's amber eyes met hers for a brief moment, alert but not fearful. There was something in that gaze that tugged at Ione's heart, pain, desperation. The animal's scarred ear and thin frame told a story of survival. Instead of shooing the animal away, Ione found herself drawn into the mystery. This wasn't normal wildlife behavior. In all her years living on the desert's edge, she'd never seen anything like it. The bobcat's precise selection of items, its repeated returns, the calculated timing, it all pointed to something more than simple animal instinct. That evening, Ione laid out her old survey maps on the kitchen table, marking the direction of the bobcat's tracks. Her father had taught her to read the desert like a book, and now those lessons pulled at her conscience. Something was wrong out there, and she couldn't ignore it. Before dawn the next morning, Ione laced up her sturdy boots and packed a small backpack. She pulled on her familiar work jacket, the pockets still filled with survey markers and notation pads. The sun was just beginning to paint the horizon in soft pinks and oranges as she set out, following the clear trail of bobcat prints into the desert. The tracks led her through familiar territory at first, past the old saguaro cactus that marked the edge of her regular survey route, beyond the rocky outcrop where desert foxes often denned. But then they veered into an area she rarely visited, where the desert scrub grew thicker and the terrain more challenging. An hour into her trek, something caught her eye. There, snagged on a strand of barbed wire, was a familiar patch of fabric. Ione's heart sank as she recognized the pattern. It was from her missing quilt, the one her grandmother had made. But it wasn't the lost quilt that made her blood run cold. It was what she found next. Hidden in the brush, partially covered by desert debris, was a steel snare. The cruel device was expertly camouflaged, its metal teeth waiting to catch unsuspecting prey. Nearby, she found more traps laid out in a careful pattern, some already sprung and empty. This wasn't about wildlife control or protection. These were illegal traps, set to catch and hurt. Ione stood very still, her mind racing. The bobcat's behavior suddenly made terrible sense. It wasn't just taking things randomly. It was gathering soft items, perhaps to protect itself or its young from these hidden dangers. The animal she'd seen, with its scarred ear and wary eyes, had likely already experienced the trap's brutality firsthand. Looking around with new understanding, Ione saw the desert differently now. The peaceful morning landscape held a darker secret. Someone was systematically trapping wildlife here, far enough from regular pots to avoid detection, but close enough to her home that the bobcat had found an unlikely source of protection. In her porch items, she pulled out her phone and began documenting everything: the locations, the types of traps, the signs of recent activity. Her survey training proved useful as she methodically recorded the evidence. This wasn't just about missing porch items anymore. This was about something much more sinister. Something that needed to be stopped. The Bobcat's desperate scavenging had led her to uncover a cruel operation right in her backyard. As Ione carefully marked the location on her GPS unit, she realized that her quiet life on the desert's edge had just become considerably more complicated. The mystery of her missing items had revealed the truth she couldn't ignore, and now she had to decide what to do about it. Her hands shook slightly as she photographed the last trap, but her resolve was firm. The Bobcat had trusted her space as a source of safety. Now it was up to her to make sure that trust wasn't misplaced. Someone was exploiting the desert's wildlife, and they had picked the wrong backyard to do it in. After discovering the snare, Ione's hands trembled as she dialed the sheriff's department. She'd hoped for a serious response, but what she got was Deputy Reed Hollis's dismissive drawl through her phone speaker. "We'll send someone out to take a look, Ms. Beckett," he said, sounding more annoyed than concerned. An hour later, a cloud of dust announced the arrival of two vehicles. Deputy Hollis's patrol car and a gleaming black pickup truck. Ione watched. From her porch as Clayton Maris, the gravel pit owner, stepped out of the truck. His expensive boots crunched on the gravel, and his pressed ranch shirt seemed out of place in the dusty desert setting. "Found this on my routine patrol," Hollis said, though Ione hadn't mentioned the location to him. He was already holding the snare she'd discovered, handling it as if it were nothing more than a piece of trash. Maris moved closer, his bulk casting a shadow across the ground. "These predators are becoming a real problem around here," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "Just last week, I lost valuable guard dogs at my property." Ione felt her face flush. This isn't about predators. Someone's deliberately baiting that Bobcat. "I've seen it taking specific items, bright things, soft things. It's not natural behavior." Deputy Hollis's face hardened. "Ms. Beckett, were you aware you were trespassing on private property when you found this?" He held up the snare. "I was following tracks from my own property," Ione defended herself. "There's something wrong here. That Bobcat is a nuisance animal," Maris interrupted. "I've filed 3 complaints already about predator activity. This is exactly why we need those expansion permits to better secure the area." Ione knew about those permits. Maris had been pushing to expand his gravel pit operations into the protected riparian zones, areas that served as crucial wildlife corridors. "With all due respect, Mr. Maris," Ione tried again. "This isn't normal wildlife behavior. Someone's manipulating." "Ms. Beckett," Deputy Hollis cut in, his tone carrying a clear warning. "I suggest you stick to your surveying work and leave wildlife management to the professionals. Next time you have concerns, call animal control and stay off private property." They left her standing there, the snare disappearing into Hollis's patrol car. Ione watched them drive away, her chest tight with frustration. She'd expected skepticism, but this felt different, like they'd arrived with their minds already made up. That evening, Ione sat on her porch, the desert wind carrying the scent of sage and creosote. Her thoughts kept returning to the way Maris and Hollis had dismissed her concerns. Something about their quick appearance together, their ready explanations, felt rehearsed. A movement in the growing darkness caught her eye. The Bobcat was back, its form barely visible in the twilight. This time it took a bright blue dishcloth she'd deliberately left out, along with a small piece of yellow nylon rope. Ione documented everything in her notebook: time, items, the direction the cat traveled. She noticed the pattern more clearly now. The items taken were always brightly colored or made of soft material. It wasn't random scavenging. It was too specific. But when she tried calling animal control the next morning, they treated her like she was imagining things. "Ma'am, Bobcats don't collect household items," the bored voice on the phone told her. "Are you sure it wasn't a coyote? Or maybe the wind?" Ione hung up, her isolation feeling more acute than ever. She lived alone on the desert's edge by choice, preferring the company of her maps and survey equipment to most people. But now that solitude felt heavy, oppressive. The authorities weren't just dismissing her. They seemed determined to ignore what was happening. Looking out across the desert, toward where Maris's gravel pit scarred the landscape, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd stumbled onto something bigger than missing household items. The way Maris had appeared with Hollis, his casual mention of the expansion permits, the convenient predator complaints, it all felt connected. That afternoon, more items disappeared from her porch, a red handkerchief and a bright green pot holder. Ione added them to her growing list of missing objects, noting how the Bobcat seemed to favor anything that stood out against the desert's muted palette. The sun was setting when Deputy Hollis's patrol car appeared again, kicking up dust as it approached her house. He didn't bother getting out, just rolled down his window. Got another complaint about you making nuisance calls, he said, his face half hidden in shadow. Mr. Maris is concerned about your allegations. He's a respected businessman trying to bring jobs to this area. Best be careful about spreading stories, Ms. Beckett. The threat in his voice was unmistakable. As his car disappeared into the gathering darkness, Ione felt the weight of her isolation more keenly than ever. But beneath her anxiety, something else was growing: determination. They might treat her as unreliable, but she knew what she'd seen. The question was, what was she going to do about it? Inside her house, Ione spread her survey maps across the kitchen table, studying the area around her property. Her finger traced the boundaries of Maris's current operations, then moved to the protected zones he coveted. Somewhere in the relationship, between those lines and the Bobcat's strange behavior, she was sure there was an answer. She just had to find it. After another restless night, Ione pulled her father's old trail cameras from their dusty storage boxes. Her hands traced the familiar equipment with reverence, remembering how he taught her to track and document wildlife patterns. Evidence tells stories, he always said, if you know how to read it. The morning sun cast long shadows as she positioned 3 cameras strategically around her porch. Her survey training helped her calculate the optimal angles and distances. She tested each one, making sure the infrared sensors would catch any movement, day or night. Inside, Ione ranged more colorful items on the porch: a bright orange towel, a child's purple sock she'd found in her laundry, and a yellow dish rack. Then she waited. The first footage came that night. Ione's hands trembled as she reviewed it on her laptop. There it was, the Bobcat, moving with precise purpose. It wasn't just grabbing things randomly. The cat approached from the same direction, each time following what looked like an invisible path. Something clicked in her mind. Pulling out her survey maps, she traced the Bobcat's route. It aligned perfectly with Maris's proposed expansion lines, the same ones she'd helped flag last month during her contract work. This isn't natural, she whispered to herself, watching the footage again. The Bobcat's behavior was too regular, too calculated. Wild animals didn't move like that unless they were being influenced. Over the next 2 days, she gathered more evidence. The camera footage showed the same pattern. The Bobcat approaching along the survey lines, selecting only bright items, moving with unnatural precision. Ione documented everything meticulously, but her growing collection of evidence made her increasingly uneasy. This felt bigger than she could handle alone. That's when she remembered Nadine Kittredge. They'd met briefly at a town meeting last year when Nadine had spoken against reducing wildlife protections. Ione had been impressed by her straightforward manner and obvious expertise. Finding Nadine's number wasn't easy. The wildlife rehabilitator kept a low profile. When Ione finally reached her, she tried to sound professional despite her nervousness. Ms. Kittredge, this is Ione Beckett. I'm calling about some unusual Bobcat behavior I've documented. There was a pause on the line. The survey tech from the desert edge. Nadine's voice was sharp. Interested. I remember you from the council meeting. What kind of behavior? Ione described everything: the stolen items, the survey line patterns, the camera footage. She held her breath, waiting for the dismissal she'd grown used to. Instead, Nadine said, I'll be there in 30 minutes. Don't share the footage with anyone else. True to her word. Nadine's dusty truck pulled up exactly 30 minutes later. She was shorter than Ione remembered, but her presence filled the room. She watched the footage in complete silence, her weathered face growing harder with each clip. Well, Nadine said finally, you've got something here. All right, she turned to face Ione. And you say Maris and Deputy Hollis brushed you off. They acted like I was making trouble, Ione admitted. Said I was trespassing when I found the snare. Nadine's expression darkened. Classic Maris. He's been trying to get those expansion permits for years. Keeps filing predator complaints. But we could never prove he was manufacturing the problem. She gestured at Ione's laptop. Until now. You believe me? Ione hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words until they brought tears to her eyes. Honey, I've been waiting for someone to bring me solid evidence against that man for 3 years. Nadine's voice was fierce with approval. You've done good work here. Professional level documentation. But you're right. This is dangerous stuff. Maris is friends in high places. What should we do? First, we back up this footage. Multiple copies, secure locations. Nadine pulled out her phone. Then we start building a case. I've still got contacts in wildlife enforcement who aren't on Maris's payroll. But we have to move carefully. For the first time since finding that first snare, Ione felt her shoulders relax. She wasn't alone anymore. Looking at Nadine's determined face, She knew she'd found someone who understood both the importance and the danger of what she'd uncovered. "Red, that bobcat," Nadine said thoughtfully, watching the footage again. "It's likely a mother. The way it's selecting soft items, probably. Has a cub somewhere. They're using her instincts against her. Poor thing." She turned to Ione with fierce approval. "You did right to pay attention. Most people would have written it off as nuisance wildlife." "My father taught me to notice patterns," Ione said softly. "He always said nature has reasons for everything it does." "Smart man." Nadine squeezed her shoulder. "And he raised a smart daughter. Now, let's get to work. We've got a long fight ahead of us, but together we might just have a chance of stopping whatever game Maris is playing." The early morning sun cast long shadows across the desert floor as Ione and Nadine made their way along the drainage area. Their boots crunched softly on the gravelly soil, following the telltale signs of both human and animal traffic that marked the area. "Look here," Nadine whispered, pointing to distinctive paw prints in a patch of soft earth the mother bobcats been through recently. "See how fresh these tracks are?" Ione nodded, noting how the marks showed clear definition without any wind-blown debris filling them in. They continued carefully, Nadine leading the way with the practiced movements of someone used to tracking wildlife. The morning was quiet, except for the occasional call of desert birds. Suddenly, Nadine threw out an arm, stopping Ione in her tracks. "Listen." A faint mewling sound carried on the breeze, weak, desperate cries that made Ione's heart clench. They moved forward more cautiously, and then they saw it, a small bobcat cub. It spotted fur dulled by dust and distress, caught in a cruel wire snare. The tiny creature struggled weakly, its strength clearly fading. "Oh no," Ione breathed, her throat tight with emotion. Movement caught their attention. The mother bobcat paced nearby, keeping a wary distance but unwilling to abandon her trapped young. Her amber eyes watched them intently, ears flattened in distress. Nadine pulled wire cutters from her vest pocket. "We need to work fast. That cub's dehydrated and won't last much longer." They approached slowly, trying not to frighten the mother. Further, the cub's cries grew more urgent, and Ione could see where the wire had cut into its leg. "How long has it been here?" "At least 2 days, judging by the condition," Nadine replied grimly, kneeling beside the snare. "This is a legal trap. Placement, it's not tagged, and it's designed to cause suffering." The distant sound of an engine shattered the morning quiet. Nadine's head snapped up. ATV. Coming fast, the motor's growl grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls. Without hesitation, Nadine finished cutting the wire. Ione scooped up the weakened cub, and they scrambled toward a cluster of large rocks. "Here," Nadine hissed, pulling Ione behind a boulder just as the ATV crested the rise. They pressed themselves against the cool stone, hearts pounding. The cub trembled in Ione's arms, but stayed quiet. The ATV's engine cut off. Heavy boots crunched on gravel. "I know you're out here." Deputy Hollis's voice boomed across the drainage. "Show yourselves." Ione felt Nadine's hand squeeze her arm in warning. They remained still, barely breathing. The mother bobcat had vanished like a ghost into the desert brush. More footsteps approached their position. "This is private property," Hollis continued, "and you're interfering with legal predator control." "Legal?" Nadine muttered under her breath. "Nothing about this is legal." The footsteps grew closer. Ione cradled the cub, feeling its rapid heartbeat against her chest. Hollis's shadow fell across the ground near their hiding place, and then his radio crackled. "Got movement at the north end," a voice reported. "Looks like they went that way." Hollis cursed. "Hand over any cameras or phones you've got," he shouted. "I'll find them anyway, and it'll go worse for you if you make me search." Nadine pulled out her old camera. "It's documented already," she whispered. "Sometimes you have to sacrifice a pawn." She placed it on a rock where it would be visible. They listened as Hollis retrieved the camera, his boots scuffing on the rocks. "Last warning," he called out. "Maris has every right to protect his interest. These cats are problem predators. Got the documentation to prove it. Depredation permits already being processed." The ATV's engine roared back to life. They waited until the sound faded completely before emerging from their hiding place. The cub had fallen still in Ione's arms, exhausted but alive. "He's creating a paper trail," Ione said, the full weight of the situation hitting her. "All those stolen items, the documented problems. It's all manufactured to justify killing these cats and expanding into their territory." Nadine nodded, grimly. "And now we have proof of their methods." She pulled a smaller camera from inside her jacket. Never trust a wildlife officer who only looks in the obvious places. The mother bobcat reappeared at the edge of their vision, watching intently. Under Nadine's guidance, Ione set the cub down in clear view. They backed away slowly, and the mother darted in to retrieve her young, disappearing into the brush. "What?" we saw today wasn't just about trapping, Nadine said as they made their way back. This is systematic abuse of wildlife management laws. Maris is building his case on manufactured evidence, and Hollis is helping him do it. Ione looked back toward where the bobcats had vanished. They're counting on nobody caring enough to stop them. That's right, Nadine replied. And that's exactly why we have to. Back in her small adobe house, Ione spread the recovered items across her kitchen table. The dim evening light filtering through her windows cast long shadows over the peculiar collection. Her niece's red rain boot, fragments of her grandmother's quilt, a bright blue plastic bucket, and various other household items the bobcat had taken from her porch. Something about these thefts had never made sense. Wild animals didn't usually target such specific items, and they certainly didn't return night after night for more. Her fingers traced the worn edges of the quilt piece, and she noticed an odd, slick feeling on the fabric. There has to be more to this, she muttered, pushing back from the table. Her father's old gear might help solve this mystery. She headed to the storage closet where she kept his wildlife tracking equipment. Among the dusty boxes, she found what she was looking for: an ultraviolet flashlight. Her father had used it to track nocturnal animals and detect markings that weren't visible to the naked eye. With trembling hands, she clicked it on and returned to the kitchen. The moment she shined the UV light over the items, her breath caught in her throat. Fluorescent streaks glowed across the surfaces, oily sheens that shouldn't have been there. The pattern was unmistakable on every single item. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. These weren't random marks. They were deliberate applications of lure mixtures. She'd seen similar techniques used in wildlife research, but this was different. This was calculated. The distinctive smell finally registered in her mind. Anise and fish oil, classic attractants, used by trappers. Someone had deliberately baited her belongings, creating an irresistible trail for the bobcat to follow. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The animal wasn't a nuisance predator at all. It was being manipulated, set up to appear as one. Ione sank into a kitchen chair, her mind racing. The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Clayton Maris needed evidence of problem predators to fast-track his development plans. Deputy Hollis had been suspiciously quick to dismiss her concerns. They weren't just ignoring the truth. They were actively manufacturing a false narrative. Her hands shook as she examined item after item under the UV light. Each one bore the same deliberate markings. The bobcat mother wasn't randomly stealing. She was following an intentionally laid trail, probably leading her straight into those cruel snares they discovered. "They're framing her," Ione said aloud, anger rising in her chest. "They're using my things to create a pattern, to make it look like she's a threat to human property." The image of the trapped cub flashed through her mind, followed by the mother's desperate pacing nearby. These weren't the actions of nuisance animals. This was the story of a mother trying to survive in the face of calculated human cruelty. Ione carefully photographed each item under the UV light, documenting the evidence of the lures. Her hands were steady now, driven by purpose rather than anger. This wasn't just about protecting wildlife anymore. This was about exposing fraud and corruption. She reached for her phone to call Nadine, then hesitated. The wildlife rehabilitator needed to see this in person. This evidence changed everything. What they'd initially thought was a simple case of wildlife management was actually a carefully orchestrated scheme to manipulate the system. The stolen items on her table no longer represented losses. They were proof of something far more sinister. Every piece told the same story of powerful men willing to orchestrate environmental fraud for profit, using an innocent animal as their scapegoat. Ione gathered the items carefully, storing them in sealed plastic bags to preserve the evidence. Her quiet life as a survey technician seemed far away now. She had stumbled onto something much bigger than herself, but she couldn't walk away. That bobcat mother and her cub were counting on her, even if they didn't know it. The truth she'd uncovered lit a fire in her heart. She wasn't just fighting against nuisance wildlife anymore. She was standing up against calculated fraud and corruption. The question now wasn't whether to act, but how to prove what she'd discovered before Maris and Hollis could complete their scheme. As she secured the last bag of evidence, Ione felt a strange mix of fear and determination. They had underestimated her, dismissed her as just another complaining resident, but she had found their weakness, the physical proof of their deception. Now she just had to figure out how to use it before they could silence her or harm any more innocent creatures. Back in her small adobe house, Ione spread the recovered items across her kitchen table. The dim evening light filtering through her windows cast long shadows over the peculiar collection. Her niece's red rain boot, fragments of her grandmother's quilt, a bright plastic flower pot, and several other items that had vanished from her Porch over the past weeks. Something about the items had been nagging at her mind. They weren't just random thefts. There was a pattern she couldn't quite grasp. Drawing from her years of survey work, where details could make or break a project, she knew sometimes you had to look at things differently to see the truth. Ione reached for her father's old ultraviolet flashlight, a tool he'd used for mineral identification. Her hands trembled slightly as she clicked it on, sweeping the purple beam across the recovered items. Her breath caught in her throat. There, gleaming under the UV light, were telltale oily sheens on every single object. I knew it, she whispered, her voice tight with anger and validation. The shimmer wasn't natural. It was the distinct residue of anise and fish oil, classic wildlife lures used by trappers. Someone had deliberately contaminated her belongings to attract the Bobcat. Energized by the discovery, Ione cleared her drafting table and spread out her survey maps. With precise movements born from years of practice, she began marking locations. Red dots for each item stolen from her porch, blue crosses for the trap sites she and Nadine had discovered, and green lines following Maris's survey flags. Her technical training took over as she worked. She plotted coordinates, measured distances, and drew connecting lines. The pattern emerged like a constellation taking shape in the night sky. The Bobcat's path wasn't random at all. It followed a carefully planned route that aligned perfectly with Maris's proposed expansion area. This isn't just about framing the Bobcats, Ione murmured, tracing the lines with her finger. It's about creating a paper trail. Every theft, every nuisance report, they're building a case for those depredation permits. Working through the night, Ione created detailed overlays using transparent sheets. Each layer told part of the story: property boundaries, wildlife, corridors, the locations of her stolen items, and Maris's proposed development. When stacked together, they revealed an undeniable pattern of deliberate manipulation. Her survey equipment came next. With methodical precision, she packed her tripod, total station, and GPS unit. She knew every public easement in the area, places where neither Maris nor Deputy Hollis could legally stop her from working. She'd lost her first set of trail cameras to Hollis's intimidation, but she wasn't about to let that stop her. Dawn was breaking as Ione drove her weathered pickup to the first location. The desert air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and creosote. She worked quickly, but carefully, setting up new trail cameras in carefully chosen spots. Each location offered clear sight lines to Maris's flag survey lines, while remaining firmly on public land or her own property. Her surveyor's skills proved invaluable as she documented each camera's position with professional accuracy. She created detailed site maps, noting angles, distances, and timestamps. If anyone questioned her evidence later, she would have irrefutable proof of where and when each image was captured. Let's see them try to dismiss this, she said to herself, securing the last camera. Her voice carried a new strength, the confidence of someone who had finally found solid ground to stand on. Back at her house, Ione created a master document combining all her evidence. Her survey notes, UV photographs, coordinate mappings, and camera locations formed a comprehensive record that would be difficult to ignore or discredit. She made multiple copies, storing them in different locations. Years of working with legal documentation had taught her the importance of backup plans. For the first time since this had all begun, Ione felt a sense of control returning. She wasn't just reacting anymore. She was building a case methodically and professionally. Her technical skills, so often overlooked or dismissed, were now her strongest weapons. Looking at her completed work spread across the table, Ione felt a quiet pride. This wasn't just about protecting wildlife anymore. It was about standing up to the kind of people who thought they could bulldoze their way through both nature and justice. They had underestimated her, assuming she would back down in the face of authority. Instead, they had pushed her to fight back with every skill she possessed. The morning sun now streamed through her windows, illuminating her work. The geometric patterns of her overlays told a clear story of deception and manipulation. But more importantly, they showed a path forward, a way to expose the truth using the very precision and attention to detail that defined her professional life. In the warm glow of sunrise, Ione sat at her makeshift surveillance station, a folding table set up in her spare bedroom. 3 laptop screens displayed feeds from the carefully positioned trail cameras. Her surveyor's maps covered the walls, marked with red pins showing the pattern of thefts and trap locations. The geometric overlay sheet created revealed an undeniable connection between Maris's proposed expansion and the Bobcat incidents. Her patience was rewarded at 7:15 in the morning when movement caught her eye on the center screen. A dusty pickup truck pulled up to the Martinez family's house to streets over. The foreman from Maris's gravel pit, Ray Dobson, stepped out carrying what looked like a bundle of cloth. Ione leaned closer, her heart racing as she watched him carefully place the items on the Martinez's front porch. "Got you," she whispered, clicking rapidly to save the footage. The camera's zoom revealed Dobson carefully arranging the cloth, his movements deliberate and practiced. An hour later, her second camera caught the same truck rolling slowly along the culvert, where they'd found the trapped Bobcat cub. Dobson emerged again, this time checking and adjusting snares with practiced efficiency. The high-resolution footage clearly showed him handling the wire traps and refreshing bait stations. Ione's hands shook as she compiled the evidence. "This is it," she said to herself, carefully backing up the files to multiple drives. She'd learned from losing her previous cameras to always have backups. That afternoon, she met Nadine in the parking lot of the local diner. The wildlife rehabilitator's face lit up as she reviewed the footage on Ione's tablet. "This is exactly what we needed," Nadine said, her weathered face breaking into a rare smile. "I've already contacted State Wildlife Investigator Matthews. He's willing to meet with us today." 2 hours later, they sat across from Investigator Matthews in his office, the evidence playing on his computer screen. The investigator's expression grew increasingly serious as he watched the compilation of footage. "Ms. Beckett," he said, turning to face her, "this is compelling evidence of wildlife harassment and illegal trapping. We'll be suspending Mr. Maris's permit application immediately pending a full investigation." Relief flooded through Ione's body. After weeks of being dismissed and doubted, finally someone with authority was taking action. The investigator made several calls, and by that evening, official notices had been served to both Maris and the county office. Later that night, Ione and Nadine celebrated with coffee on Ione's back porch, watching the desert stars emerge in the darkening sky. "You did it," Nadine said, her voice proud but cautious. "Your persistence and attention to detail paid off." But she paused, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "But what?" Ione asked, though she already sensed what was coming. "Men like Clayton. Maris don't take defeat easily," Nadine warned, her expression serious in the porch light. "They're used to getting their way. When they don't, they often push back harder." Ione nodded, understanding the weight of Nadine's words. "I know, but at least now we have proof. Real, undeniable proof." "True," Nadine agreed, "and that's significant. But stay alert. This might just be the beginning." They sat in companionable silence, the desert night wrapping around them like a familiar blanket. The victory felt real, but fragile, like holding a butterfly. Beautiful, but requiring careful handling to preserve. Inside, Ione's wall of evidence stood as testament to her methodical work, the map showing the perfect alignment of theft reports, with Maris's proposed expansion route, the UV-lit photographs of planted bait, and now the damning video footage. She'd used every skill from her years of survey work, precision, patience, and attention to detail to build an airtight case. The next morning brought an unusual quiet to the neighborhood. The Bobcat sightings had mysteriously ceased, and Maris's trucks were notably absent from their usual routes. It felt like the calm before a storm. But Ione took comfort in knowing she had done everything right. She had protected her evidence, followed proper channels, and most importantly, helped expose the truth. As she stood at her kitchen window, watching the sunrise paint the desert in shades of pink and gold, Ione reflected on how far she'd come. From that first morning when she'd found her niece's boot missing, what had started as a simple mystery had evolved into something far more significant. A stand against corruption and cruelty. The morning light caught the edge of her father's old survey transit, still sitting on her desk from when she'd used it to map the trap locations. He'd always taught her that the truth was in the details, in the careful measurement and documentation of reality. Now those lessons had helped her protect not just her neighborhood, but the wildlife that called this desert home. A roadrunner darted across her yard, pausing briefly to eye her through the window before disappearing into the brush. Life in the desert was continuing as it should, at least for now. The fragile peace felt earned, even if temporary. The morning peace shattered with the growl of heavy machinery. Ione rushed to her front window, her heart dropping at the sight of Maris's yellow bulldozer rumbling down the street. Through her binoculars, she could see Clayton Maris himself in the cab, his face set with grim determination. She grabbed her phone, dialing Nadine with trembling fingers. "He's heading toward the culvert, right where we found the cub. The state order hasn't been officially processed yet." Nadine's voice crackled through the speaker. "He's trying to act in that window. I'll call the investigator, but it'll take time." Ione was already pulling on her boots. "The mother and cub are still in that area. I saw them yesterday." She grabbed her camera, documenting as she moved. The sky above was darkening ominously, unusual for this time of day. Her phone buzzed with an emergency alert, flash flood warning. Municipal water release upstream scheduled. The pieces clicked together with horrifying clarity. Maris knew about the water release. This wasn't just about destroying evidence. It was timed for maximum damage. She ran toward the culvert, her survey boots pounding against the packed earth. The bulldozer had already reached the drainage area, its blade poised above the rocky outcrop where they'd found the snares. Through the rising wind, she heard the distant roar of approaching water. "Stop," she screamed, waving her arms. "There are animals in there." Maris's voice boomed through a megaphone. "This is authorized maintenance work. Clear the area immediately." The bulldozer's blade scraped against rock, sending a shower of debris toward the culvert entrance. A frightened cry echoed from inside, the unmistakable sound of the bobcat cub. Ione's stomach lurched. The mother was nowhere in sight, probably. Scared away by the machinery, the first surge of water rounded the bend upstream, a churning brown wall carrying branches and debris. Ione had seconds to decide. The cub's cry came again, weaker this time. Without hesitation, she scrambled into the culvert. Her headlamp illuminated the curved walls as she crouched low, moving as fast as she dared. Behind her, the roar of water grew louder. The bulldozer's vibrations sent small rocks pattering down. Around her, 20 feet in, she found the cub. It was trapped behind a fallen section of concrete, its leg caught in the same spot they'd freed it from before. The rising water had already reached its chest. "I've got you," she whispered, reaching for the terrified creature. The cub was too exhausted to fight as she worked to free its leg. Above them, the culvert groaned as the bulldozer shifted more. Weight. The water reached Ione's waist, shockingly cold and strong. More debris rained down. Maris was deliberately destabilizing the structure. She finally freed the cub, clutching it to her chest, but when she turned back, the entrance was a wall of rushing water. The current knocked her sideways. She slammed against the culvert wall, barely keeping the cub above water. Its tiny heart hammered against her hands as she fought to keep her footing. The water rose higher, leaving only a pocket of air at the top of the tunnel. Rocks continued to fall, some large enough to bruise. One glanced off her shoulder, nearly making her lose her grip on the cub. The water pushed them further into the darkness, away from the entrance. Her headlamp caught glimpses of churning brown water and concrete walls closing in. Ione's lungs burned. The space for air was disappearing. The cub trembled against her chest, its fear matching her own. The roar of water became deafening, disorienting. Her feet lost contact with the bottom. Just when panic threatened to overwhelm her, her hand brushed metal, the rungs of an emergency maintenance ladder she'd noted in her surveys. With the last of her strength, she pulled herself up, fighting the current that tried to tear them away. The water continued to rise, but now she had an anchor. The cub clung to her jacket, somehow sensing she was its only hope. Together they waited in the darkness, time measured only by their rapid breathing and the thundering water. Minutes stretched like hours. Ione's arms ached from holding their position. The current tugged relentlessly at her legs. She thought of her father, of all the times he taught her to respect the power of nature. But this wasn't nature. This was deliberate cruelty, and she refused to let it win. The water level finally began to drop, though the current remained dangerous. Ione's hands were numb from gripping the ladder, her clothes heavy with water and mud. The cub hadn't made a sound since their ordeal began, but she could feel it breathing against her chest, alive. Despite everything Maris had tried, they were still trapped, waiting for the water to recede enough for safe passage. In the beam of her headlamp, Ione saw the destruction the surge had caused. The culvert walls were scoured clean, any evidence of Maris's traps washed away. She realized that had been his plan all along, to destroy proof of his scheme while making it look like routine maintenance gone wrong. But he hadn't counted on her being willing to risk everything to save one small life. As she held the trembling cub, Ione knew this moment had changed everything. There could be no going back to being the quiet surveyor who kept her head down. Some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The roar of water filled the culvert as Ione pressed herself against the cold metal walls. Her arms trembled as she gripped her survey tripod, using it to brace against the rising current. The terrified bobcat cub clung to her jacket, its tiny claws digging through the fabric. "Hold on, little one," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the thundering water. The surge from the upstream release was turning the usually dry culvert into a death trap. Debris crashed against the metal sides, each impact sending shivers through the structure. The water level climbed past her knees, then her waist. Her boots slipped on the slick surface as she adjusted her stance. The tripod's legs scraped against metal as she wedged it more firmly, creating their only anchor point against the current. A grinding sound from above made her heart skip. Rocks were starting to cave in where the dozer had weakened the culvert's support. A chunk of concrete crashed down mere feet away, sending up a spray of water. "We can't stay here," she gasped, but retreat wasn't possible. The current was too strong behind them, and ahead lay only darkness filled with rushing water. The cub whimpered, pressing closer to her chest. Its fur was soaked, its small body shivering. Ione thought of how far they'd come from discovering the theft of her items to uncovering Maris's cruel scheme. She couldn't let it end here, not with this innocent creature's life in her hands. Suddenly, brilliant red light flooded the culvert entrance. The harsh glare of emergency flares cut through the gloom, casting everything in crimson shadows. The dozer's engine, which had been a constant rumble overhead, fell silent. "Ione." Nadine's voice carried down the tunnel. "Hold on, we're getting you out." A new voice joined the chaos. Deputy Hollis, his tone sharp with anger. "This is a restricted work zone. Clear out now." "Not happening," Nadine shot back. "And you might want to smile. You're live on camera." Ione could hear the fury in Hollis's response. "Put that phone down. This is an official operation." "Official operation?" Nadine's laugh was cold. "More like attempted murder. Every second of this is streaming to the Wildlife Protection Network." The water continued rising, now reaching Ione's chest. She hugged the cub tighter with one arm while maintaining her grip on the tripod. Small rocks and debris pelted her shoulders as more of the culvert's ceiling crumbled. "I said put it down." Hollis's voice cracked like a whip. Through the red-lit entrance, Ione saw him raise his rifle. "Deputy." A new voice boomed across the scene. "Lower your weapon immediately." The commanding tone belonged to a state trooper. More voices joined in, multiple cars' doors slamming. Help had arrived. "This is Sergeant Martinez. State Police. Everyone stay where you are." Ione heard running footsteps above. Shouts of authority. The sound of Hollis protesting as his weapon was taken. Through it all, she focused on keeping herself and the cub stable against the current. "Throw us a line," Nadine called out. "They're still trapped in there." Moments later, a rescue rope snaked down the culvert. Ione grabbed it with her free hand, wrapping it around her waist. The cub dug its claws deeper into her jacket as rescuers began pulling them to safety. As they emerged into daylight, Ione saw the full scene unfold. State troopers had surrounded the area. Hollis stood handcuffed beside his patrol car, his face twisted with rage. Clayton Maris was being led away from his dozer, his usual arrogant demeanor crumbling as officers read him his rights. Nadine rushed forward with a blanket, wrapping it around Ione and the cub. "I knew you'd need backup," she said, her eyes bright with triumph. "The whole thing's recorded. The dozer, the water release, Hollis's threats. They've got nothing left to hide behind." Ione sank to her knees, exhausted but relieved. The cub, still trembling but alive, remained pressed against her chest. Around them, evidence technicians photographed the scene while wildlife officers examined the culvert area. "You did it," Nadine said softly, squeezing Ione's shoulder. "You stood your ground when everyone else looked away. You saved more than just this little one. You saved the whole habitat." Ione watched as Maris was placed in a patrol car, his scheme finally exposed for all to see. The weight of weeks of struggle, fear, and determination began to lift. Justice had prevailed, not through force or influence, but through persistence and truth. Medical personnel approached to check her over, but Ione's focus remained on the cub. Its trust in her, even in the face of terror, had given her the strength to see this through. Together, they had survived the darkness of the culvert and emerged into the light of truth. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps. As Clayton Maris was led away in handcuffs, his expensive boots, usually gleaming, were scuffed and dusty. The arrogance had finally drained from his face, replaced by the hollow look of a man whose schemes had crumbled around him. Ione stood quietly beside Nadine, watching the scene unfold. Her hands were still scratched from the culvert rescue, but they were healing, just like everything else. Deputy Reed Hollis had already been processed earlier that morning. His badge and gun surrendered after 20 years of service. His corruption had finally caught up with him. "Never thought I'd see the day," Nadine murmured, her weathered face breaking into a satisfied smile. Both of them, brought down by a survey technician and some trail cameras, and a mother bobcat who wouldn't give up. Ione added softly, "The weeks that followed were filled with paperwork and testimonies, but also with healing." The State Wildlife Commission officially revoked Maris's expansion permit, declaring the drainage a protected habitat. The land would remain wild as it should be. On a crisp morning 3 weeks later, Ione joined Nadine at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. The bobcat cub, once frail and terrified, had grown stronger under careful care. Its spotted coat was glossy now, its eyes bright with renewed life. "Ready?" Nadine asked, checking the release carrier one final time. Ione nodded, her throat tight with emotion. They drove out to the desert, following the familiar path toward the drainage. The morning air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of sage and recent rain. They chose their spot carefully, far enough from human activity but close to where they knew the mother bobcat's territory lay. As they set up the carrier, movement caught Ione's eye. There, on the ridge above them, a familiar figure waited. The mother bobcat's scarred ear was visible even at this distance. Her amber eyes fixed on the scene below. She knew, Ione whispered. She knew we'd bring her baby back. Nadine carefully opened the carrier door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the cub emerged, cautious but steady on its feet. It looked around, whiskers twitching as it took in the familiar sense of home. When it spotted its mother on the ridge, its whole body tense with recognition. The reunion brought tears to Ione's eyes. The cub bounded up the slope, and mother and child disappeared together into the brush. The moment was perfect in its simplicity. No fanfare, just the quiet triumph of things set right. Back at her house that afternoon, Ione pulled out her niece's red rain boot from the box where she'd kept it safe. The rubber was slightly scratched but otherwise intact, a small reminder of how this had all started. Her niece's face lit up when she returned it, and Ione found herself explaining a simplified version of the story about helping animals and standing up for what's right. Later, she took out her father's old topographical map, its creases worn soft with use. He had taught her to read the land stories in those contour lines, to understand boundaries both natural and human-made. Now the map seemed to hold new meaning. She hung it carefully on her living room wall, where the evening light caught its faded colors dot as she stood back to look at it. A movement outside her window caught her attention. The mother bobcat stood at the edge of her yard, its presence no longer a threat, but a reminder. Their eyes met briefly. Wild animal and human, connected by the shared experience of fighting against injustice. Then the bobcat turned and melted away into the desert, leaving Ione with a profound sense of peace. She touched the map gently, tracing the contour lines that had helped her document the truth. She wasn't just the quiet survey technician anymore. She had found her voice, her strength, and her place in the larger story of this land. The world might see her differently now, but more importantly, she saw herself differently as someone who could stand firm against corruption and make a real difference. The desert evening settled around her house, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges. Her porch, once a place of mysterious disappearances, had become a symbol of victory. The wind chimes her father had hung years ago tinkled softly in the breeze, their familiar sound a reminder that some things remain constant, like the importance of protecting what matters, no matter the cost. Ione smiled, feeling the warmth of accomplishment and the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had helped restore balance to the small corner of the world. The bobcats were safe, the land was protected, and justice had prevailed. Sometimes, she realized, the biggest victories come from simply refusing to look away when something isn't right. If tonight's story sat quietly in your heart, subscribe and send it to someone who might need the same comfort.